Hello, and welcome to Melody Joy Quilts. I received a layer cake for Christmas called Red, White, and Bloom, and it has some patriotic prints, and I ultimately decided on this Ohio star block because you can use just some yardage, which here I just have, I believe it's the Kona white, and I'm just going to cut some 10-inch squares out of that. And you just need a little bit of background yardage and a layer cake of any kind to make these Ohio star blocks. So I'm going to cut my yardage into some 10-inch squares. And you could use a print for this if it was a low volume, something that just doesn't have a lot of color on it, as long as it mostly read as a light. And you just mainly need enough contrast to make your star points show up well. Once you have your 10-inch squares of background fabric and your 10-inch squares of prints, in this case, like I said, I'm using a layer cake, you need to pick out some of the print squares to use for making half square triangles. And we are going to do the 8 at a time half square triangle method. And then we're going to use some of those half square triangles to make quarter square triangles. And if any of that sounded intimidating, don't let it scare you. This actually is super easy. Okay, once you have chosen the prints you want to use, you need to take your background squares and you need to draw a line diagonally corner to corner. So you're basically making a giant X. And so I'm going to use my long ruler, and you can use some type of fabric marking pen, like something that's heat erasable. I'm just using a pencil. Sometimes I use a heat erasable pen, but today I'm just using a pencil. Once you have those lines drawn, you need to use a 1/4 inch foot, and I just went ahead and sewed a 1/4 inch away from those diagonal lines on either side. This is the 8 at a time half square triangle method. A lot of times in patterns, the half square triangles will just be abbreviated as HSTs, and what it stands for is half square triangles. Now, I'm using a rotating cutting mat. If you don't have one, it's okay. You don't have to use one. It just is actually pretty handy for this right here. I'm going to start by cutting my fabric in half. So 5 inches from the edge should be the center. And I'm going to cut it in on the, like a plus sign first. And then I'm going to cut it on the diagonal lines. I should be left with 8 units. And this is where that rotating cutting mat really comes in handy. Now there's a couple different ways that you can square up these half square triangles. I'm going to show you first a way that you could square it with a triangular ruler. This ruler is actually called a strip tube ruler. I got it from Cozy Quilt Designs, and it's made to use with jelly rolls, but it actually works great for this type of trimming as well. So there is a, you want to put the line that you're trying to measure on your stitch line. So in this case, I want these half square triangles, when they're opened up, to measure a 4-inch square. So I'm going to put the 4-inch line of this ruler on the stitching line. And then I'm going to trim up my edges, and I should be left with a 4-inch square when I open it up. And half of that square will be the background and half of that will be the print. And I'm going to iron it towards the dark side. So when I peel that dark fabric back, the seam will be left under the darker fabric. So I'm just going to press these open. Now I am going to have to trim off what they call the dog ears in just a minute, but I like this method of trimming up the half square triangles. Here I'm just grabbing my scissors and I'm snipping off those little bitty tips that hang over the edge. They're a little triangular shape that is hanging over the line. You don't have to trim these off, but I think it is easier to put your block together later, and it reduces bulk. Now, if you don't have a triangular ruler you can just iron your half square triangles open and then use a regular type of ruler, and any type of quilting ruler that has at least a 4-inch line on it to trim these units down to 4 inches square, just making sure that that diagonal ends up in the corner. Okay, next we're going to move on to making quarter square triangles. So that was the half. Now we're going to do a quarter. I'm going to take this red print and I'm going to put 2 of these together. Now I'm feeling with my fingers to make sure the seams are lined up. If you pressed to the dark side when you were making your half square triangles, these 2 half square triangles should nest together. Then you're going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner that crosses your seam lines. Then you're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch away from that drawn line. Again, I'm going to nest these up. I'm going to kind of lift and double check that my seams are lined up nicely. I'm going to draw that diagonal line, making sure that it crosses my seam line. And then I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch away from the line on both sides of the line. So I started with 4 of the red and white half square triangles, and right now I have 2 units. I'm going to cut these apart, and when I iron them open, I will be left with 4 quarter square triangle units. I'm cutting right on that line that I drew, and now I'm going to find the 4-inch line. Again, I'm going back to that same ruler. I'm putting the 4-inch line on the stitching line, and I'm making sure that the point goes right up through that perpendicular stitch, and I'm going to iron it open, and there's a quarter square triangle unit. I'm going to keep on doing this trimming until I have 4 of these trimmed to 4 inches. Then it will be time to assemble our block. I'm going to show you those quarter square triangles from a different angle, just in case if you are still a little unsure of how to do those. I like to always press my half square triangles to the dark side of the whatever fabric is darker. That way when I go to lay them on top of each other, the seams will nest up. Then you draw your line perpendicular to your seam line, and then you sew a 1/4 inch away from the line on both sides, because later you're going to cut it on that line. And so from those 2 half square triangles, you'll end up with 2 quarter square triangles. So now that you've sewn on both sides of the line, you're going to cut directly on that line. Now we're going to trim all of these down to 4 inches. So I'm using that ruler, the strip tube ruler from Cozy Quilt Designs. I am putting the 4-inch line right on my stitch line, and I'm trimming that up to 4 inches. Now I'm just trimming off those little dog ears, those little tiny the little tiny tips that hang over, ironing it, and that's a quarter square triangle. Easy peasy. Now, if you don't have a fancy ruler, don't panic. Go ahead and iron it open, and then just take whatever ruler that you have, and you're trimming it up to 4 inches. And I just make sure that my corner of my ruler is on the diagonal line. That way, all of my points are where they need to be. It's important to note on the quarter square triangle that you want that center where the 4 colors come together to be right in the center of your block. So you want to trim from both edges, from all 4 sides. Otherwise, your center will be off center, if that makes sense, hopefully. Okay, now that we have half square triangles and quarter square triangles all squared up to 4 inches, let's lay out a block together. You need a center square, whatever print you want for your center. You need 4 quarter square triangles that match, and then also 4 half square triangles. The 4 quarter square triangles go with a background edge pointing towards your center block, and the 4 half square triangles go with the print, the darker side, pointing out. So out towards the corners. And then that way you get really nice crisp star points. This block is so easy and so fast, especially if you already have a layer cake. It just goes so quickly, and I think you get a lot of bang for your buck with this one just because I feel like the design really pops. It is important to make sure that you have good contrast. That way, you know, all your star points will show up nicely. I'm just sewing these together with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm gonna press all of them away from the hourglass blocks, from the quarter square triangle blocks. I'm gonna press them either towards the plain center square or towards the half square triangles. That way my rows will nest up later. You could always lay this quilt out with sashing and cornerstones, but if you just put these star blocks next to each other, you get a really cool secondary pattern where the corners the corner half square triangles where they come together with the block next to it. I think it creates a really cool secondary pattern that just it looks really complex, but it's really simple and straightforward. Now that I've pressed my rows, I'm gonna start assembling my rows together. Because I pressed everything away from the quarter square triangles, my rows should nest up. There's 2 seams to match. So I did take time to really make sure that the seams were right where they should be, really nested up tight, and put a clip on each of those 2 seams. This isn't really a long block at all. It's only about a 12 by 12 inch block, but I just really want it to come out as crisp as possible. So again, I'm nesting those seams up, and I'm gonna pop a clip right on top just to make sure that it doesn't slip on me while I'm sewing down the row. I love the way these star blocks came out. If you have a layer cake in your stash that you haven't had any inspiration of what to do with it, I would say get yourself some background fabric and make an Ohio star quilt. It's beautiful, it's easy, and it has a lot of wow factor. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, like it, hype it, subscribe, follow along for more, and let me know in the comments if you've made this block before or if you plan to in the future. And happy quilting!